We just entered a new decade, 2020, 2020. What was life like 100 years ago? Might not even think about it, might not cross your mind. But life 100 years ago affects us substantially today. So I put together this presentation about farming 100 years ago. It's going to talk about the major shifts that were happening 100 years ago and kind of the implications that we can see today in 2020. So you might want to know a little bit about who I am and where I'm coming from. I'm a volunteer and a regular blogger for the Plymouth Historical Society, working there as a blogger for a little over a year. I'm also a former middle school teacher with a K-12 social studies teaching license. I'm an avid learner and reader. It's very important to me. So much so that I wanted to share some of the things that I've learned on a personal blog. You can see the link there. You can check it out. I try to keep it updated regularly. Why farming? I grew up on a farm. I knew very early on I was never going to become a farmer, but I was very intrigued by many things that I experienced. And my love of history kind of pushed me to want to learn a little bit more about what was actually going on as a child in a broader, deeper context. It's also a personal project that I've been working on. I've been working on a historical fiction novel, and it's set 100 years ago, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. So a part of that research, kind of wanted to pull together some things and what I was learning about farming 100 years ago. With this being set in Wisconsin, this presentation is maybe tilted a little bit more towards the Wisconsin side of things, but many of those things apply quite well to Minnesota and other places throughout the country, and specifically the Midwest. And also, farming is incredibly relevant today. People are arguing about multiple things, whether farms are getting too large, kind of massive movements towards organic food, a dramatic shift over the past 50 years. So what are some of my goals for today? Is to answer this question, why look at farming 100 years ago? Local, organic, sustainable farming movement today is gaining more and more traction. You don't have to look far to understand this. Just recognize that places like Whole Foods are thriving and farmers markets are becoming more and more popular. CSAs are also gaining more and more loyal customers. There's this intrigue of getting local organic food because there's a little bit of a disenchantment with the other options out there. But also we want to take a look at technology. Technology is always shifting rapidly. And we think today it's shifting even more rapidly. But we could say the same thing about the 1910s and the 1920s. There were some dramatic technological shifts that would leave their mark on history and still affect us substantially today. 100 years ago is also a perfect time to examine history because of World War I. What better time to examine the world but a time when the world was in turmoil? It always seems the world's in some kind of turmoil, but World War I was definitely an increase in that turmoil for a period of time and set up some very intriguing and very important things for the remaining 100 years after World War I. And as any time when we're looking at history, we can use it as a guide for our future. We can use it as examples of what we want to avoid and things that we can maybe shift around and do better with in the future. can always gain knowledge from the past, understanding that the past is always been repeating itself. Maybe there are different factors, but it's always got some kind of repetition, and we can learn from that and try to not make those same mistakes in our future. So I'm going to start with this quote from a kind of a funny named book by Gene Logsdon. Invariably at the root of every ancient American civilization collapses an agricultural mistake. When their agriculture faltered, so did the civilization. So why am I talking about farming? Because it's of utmost importance. It is so vital to understand how to do farming right for a civilization and for the world to prosper. Because at the basis of everything is the human need for food. So let's set the stage for the 1910s and the 1920s, farming 100 years ago. What was going on in the Midwest in farming 100 years ago? We have to understand that wheat was king. In the South, cotton was king, but in the North, wheat was king. And we don't have to look far to understand this in Minnesota. We are close to Minneapolis, the mill city. Trains bringing wheat from throughout the Midwest to the mills of Minneapolis brought great prosperity to the Twin Cities area. But it also substantially changed the Midwest landscape. Because wheat was king, and because wheat was where the profit was, farmers would plant wheat year after year after year, focusing on the short-term profits and forgetting about the long-term detrimental effect on the soil and their future farming. It was a significant time. In the 1880s, King Wheat was starting to fail. Comes back to this quote from a book that I will reference often. It was a book I found at the Plymouth Historical Society and found quite enlightening about farming 100 years ago. It comes from Dr. W.E. Taylor, and it was written for John Deere. He says, "To till the land and not return to the soil the manure from the stock is simply mining, not farming. And each year, the soil is depleted of its fertility." Dr. W.E. Taylor recognized that farming was in trouble in the 1913 and 1910s, and he recognized that something needed to change. Farming was struggling at the turn of the century because the settlers' mindset was a little bit off. There were cheap lands throughout the Midwest. People were encouraged to move, and they would be prosperous. There are some problems with that. The settlers' mindset, we're going to buy up as much of it and we're going to speculate on that land. We're going to sell it for a higher cost. Gets to the very basis of exploitation for profit. The land was so fertile. It was a land that had never been farmed on a massive scale in history. There was no other virgin land really in the world. This is a substantial find in the 1800s. And because of this, farmers did not have to think about the long-term effects as much. There was a lack of education under farmers. If your land is so fertile that you don't need to think about fertilization, you don't need to think about education. You could just move on to a new farm. There was a joke that kind of went around that you would go through 3 wives and 3 farms in your life as a farmer. Basically, you could mess it up and you could move on and you'd still be okay because the land was cheap and there was a lot of it there for you. You could fail without having fertile soil. This general lack of need was ingrained in the settler's mindset. Why learn how to do it well when you don't need to? Instead, there was a lot of exploitation for profit, with wheat being king, planting the same crop year after year, not returning the manure to the soil, was setting up the Midwest to fail in the long term, even with the short-term gains. Again, another quote from Gene Logsdon. In the pioneer days of America, the virgin fertility of the soil was taken for granted, and no one thought about needing extra fertilizer. If you don't need it, why even think about it? The long-term consequences of this were substantial. It was especially bad in Wisconsin. Wheat was king in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin's soil was depleted. It was so bad that they recognized they needed to do a massive shift if they were going to be able to grow anything in Wisconsin in the long term. So what was the idea? Reestablish fertility by dairying. Bring cows to Wisconsin and you will bring fertility back to the soil. You can see in the picture, this is an ad from the Horde Dairyman magazine showing these beautiful cows relaxing in meadows, feeding on grass. Encouraging farmers, isn't this nice? Come have cows. Start dairying. And then put that manure on the land. It was so bad. The example from a Vernon County town that they needed, as an entire town collectively, to buy fertilizer and pool their money in order to be able to plant anything to feed their cows. They recognized that they needed cows, but they weren't able to feed them in the initial years of this turnaround. It was that bad. The land was so infertile. So, if you have this substantial need for dairying, you need to create a market for milk and cheese. To bring fertility back to the land, it needs to be profitable. This was all made possible by the invention of the silo. The silo allowed farmers to have a consistent income over the entire year because they could feed their animals all year long and not have to worry about keeping them having quality milk. Before the silo, they would have had less animals available to them, but they also would have made sure that those animals were not producing milk in the winter months, which meant a time of year when they would have substantially less cash flow. It would give them the opportunity for a year-long profit, which would give them the opportunity for a more successful business model. It also provided the opportunity to have barnyards for manure collection. Because the cattle could be kept by the farm instead of needing to be out in pasture and feeding themselves, they could collect that manure so they could take that manure and put it back in the fields. A very significant piece of the history. The first silo in Wisconsin was in 1880. By 1914, there were 43,000 silos, literally changing the landscape of Wisconsin forever. See this beautiful silo getting put up. The amount of work to put these up must have been intense. Again, the invention of the silo in Wisconsin and the effect on its landscape. So some of the focal points, I've gone into a lot to set a stage for farming 100 years ago. So I've got two focal points here. Farmer education. What did farmers needed to learn 100 years ago? And the second one, the technological boom. What major inventions were changing the way farming was being done 100 years ago? To the farmer. The farmer is the chosen servant to produce from the soil enough to sustain the living. Considering this, the farmer needs to have a massive amount of education. It's a very complicated job. They are a businessman, but it goes way beyond that because they have to understand animals. They also have to understand how to plant things, being an agronomist, a veterinarian. They also need to love to fix things as a mechanic. They need to be able to operate machines. They also need to be able to manage potentially employees as well as managing a business. There's so much more than even that goes into farming. And considering this, farmers need no education to get into farming, oftentimes just learning from their parents. And that's fine, and oftentimes very good. But if there's a lack of education in the older generation, and the newer generation does not pursue it themselves, you can see over a long term, lack of education is going to have a major negative effect on the role of farmer. Farmers are going to struggle. In fact, W.D. Horde of the Horde Dairymen was adamant that this was a huge problem. He says in 1889, one reason why there's so much truth in the reiterated remark, farming don't pay, is that there's not another business on the face of the earth that supports so many incompetents. They didn't know what they were doing for the vast majority of them. And this frustrated Horde to no end, which is why he created his magazine, to encourage farmers to learn how to do things better. There is a picture of W.D. Horde, and I will reference him on occasion in this presentation. So there was this myth, and I've already kind of talked about this, the dumb farmer myth. Well, where does that come from? Well, it's a clinging to the past. Being used to what they've done and not really wanting to consider something new. This is a natural human tendency. It's also a different mindset. As a farmer, you might not think about your farm as a business. It's your livelihood, sure, but you might not think of it as a business. You might think, these are my animals. These are maybe not pets, because they are your livelihood. But you might not consider selling a certain animal if it's not producing enough food or milk because you like that animal. There's an emotional aspect to farming, and that can make it difficult for some farmers to step away and look at it strictly from a business standpoint. There's a different mindset there. Not all farmers have that, but it is something that can have an effect. They're going to make dumb business decisions based on emotional attachments to the land and to the past and to their animals. Successful farming came out with this not so politically correct statement: must improve human breed. Definitely won't see that in today's Successful Farming magazine. But the point being, it wasn't a cow problem, it was a man problem. They did not know how to properly raise their animals to produce quality milk. There was a massive educational movement that started in the Civil War. The Morrill Act of 1862, signed in by Lincoln, gave universities land grants in the Midwest, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan. And those land grants produced universities like University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Minnesota. And for the first time, these universities started developing new research, developed more on a scientific side of things, rather than the traditional education of the past, of just studying past knowledge and studying that in-depthly. Their goal was to actually produce new knowledge and new research. And part of this And a major part of this was for farming, how to do farming better. So these universities all have agricultural extension services. And the purpose then was they could learn something in the lab, they could learn something on their test farms, and then they could take that into the communities and explain to farmers how to do things a little bit differently. Very much so, the purpose of W.D. Taylor and his work was to share with farmers how to do things better. A great example of this, an 1898 book, Feeds and Feeding by W.A. Henry, taught farmers for the first time, at least at that time, how to feed animals in a scientific way to provide the best quality milk and the best health for those animals. And there's a huge number of farming periodicals that popped up at the turn of the century, again trying to educate farmers to become better farmers. There are many educational topics that farmers needed to understand at this time. And going to the universities, taking short courses to really understand some of these key aspects were things that were actually happening. That's actually what this picture is a young farmer studying to do farming better. Taking a look at these topics, monitoring herd yields was such an important thing. How much milk are the cows actually producing? This could give the farmer the opportunity to, if a cow is not producing well, to maybe decide to sell it, to market for meat, or change around its food to see what the best food rations would be to produce more milk. Understanding this could allow farmers to have maybe potentially less animals, feed them the same amount of food, and produce more profit, because those animals would be the highest yielding animals, instead of having a few low yield animals pulling down the entire herd and stealing all the profits. Feed rations. I mentioned the Feeds and Feeding. It was such an important book to change the way farmers understood how to feed their animals. It matters what they're eating. They need good nutrition to produce good quality milk and be healthy animals to live long, sustainable lives, to produce, again, a profit for the farmers. Here's a big one, and the reason they even got into dairying was proper manure management. They needed to bring fertility back to the land, and that was great, but if they don't use their manure properly, it would all be for naught. This ad sharing with farmers, your soil is alive. There's bacteria, there are nutrients in the soil that can be fed and nourished and brought back to it through the use of manure. Unfortunately, the management of the manure at the time was incredibly poor. It was very common for farmers, out of somewhat laziness, but also necessity, probably didn't have the time, didn't know any better, they would throw their manure out the barn window into a large pile, and then they would hope and cross their fingers that it would snow and rain enough that enough of that pile would run off and run away that they wouldn't have to haul that away in the spring, and it would take away from a lot of their work. But they didn't understand that they were leaching all the nutrients out of this manure. They were not managing it at all, and all the positive things, the potash and the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the organic material was not getting put back into the soil. It was filtering off into a stream, like in this picture, going into the land around the farm. In fact, it was observed that farmland around the barns typically had much higher yields than farmland further away from the barns because of the way they were managing manure. Just another example of what farmers were allowing to happen. Let's let all these natural things run off the positive nutrients that they were paying for in fertilizers that they were putting on their land. But it was all there in the manure, and it was being wasted. Millions of dollars down the drain out of pure ignorance. So they shared with them different ideas of how to manage manure. Having a manure pit that was covered in a shed that would allow the manure to maintain its fertility so that it could be put out on the land. Another example of a manure shed that would protect that manure, that valuable asset for the farmer, the most valuable, gold. But also teaching them how to better manage how they spread it. It was not uncommon for farmers to throw it out in piles and again let the rain just wash it away. Easier for them, doesn't take them a whole lot of time. They also discovered that naturally the grass or whatever was growing there grew better under these piles. Farmers needed to get away from this. They also could spend a lot of time spreading these piles out evenly. That's where the invention of the manure spreader becomes so important. Here the guy is spreading it by hand. Better than the first two pictures, but still very time consuming and not nearly as effective and not nearly as a full cover. The invention of the manure spreader was a substantial thing to help farmers manage manure better. In fact, Gene Logsdon, the author of that book earlier that I mentioned, he goes as far to say that the manure spreader, not the tractor, not any of the other things, manure spreader is the most important invention in farming history. And here is that quote. The invention of the manure spreader ought to be hailed as more momentous than the plow or the automobile, but probably no technological wonder is as ill thought of than the manure spreader. And I get it. You know why? It's because it stinks. It smells awful. And yet it's so important to bring that fertility back to the soil. And it is very important. Getting back to those educational topics, the role of bacteria was significantly underestimated by farmers up until this time. They didn't really get it. But educating farmers on this would help them understand how to provide a better environment for their animals and a better environment for the milk they're providing to their customers. It was not uncommon for farmers to leave their milk in the milk house for a few days before taking it to market. It was also not uncommon for many, many infants to die from raw milk, which led to the pasteurization of milk on a 100% scale, even to this day. It was this mismanagement and misunderstanding of the role of bacteria that caused so many catastrophic events. Teaching farmers to understand that sunlight would actually clean the air naturally and kill bad bacteria. That cleaning the feed troughs of the animals and the water tanks and keeping the barn as clean as possible would be better for their animals and better for their product they were producing. Milk and cheese quality was of utmost importance. As I mentioned earlier, Wisconsin needed to create a market for milk and cheese. And we know Wisconsin today as America's dairyland, but that was not always what it was. Wisconsin was actually a place that nobody would want to buy cheese from. It was so bad that Europeans refused to buy anything but New York cheese. Wisconsin cheese farmers were known for cutting corners, adding vegetable oils to their cheese to increase profits and save money. Clearly, very low quality, not something other people wanted to be eating. They are also commonly known to water down their milk. More milk meant more money. That's where the Babcock test comes into play. The Babcock test finally gave a way for factories and milk producers to prove the quality of their milk. The fat content of their milk could be tested quickly and prices be given accordingly. The basic essentials of the Babcock test is a centrifuge that would allow whoever was running it to determine the milk fat. The milk fat, higher the milk fat content, the higher the quality, the better premium price they would get. Finally, air quality. Tuberculosis was a huge issue for farmers, as it would spread throughout their animals and cause them to die, and also spread to their families. Understanding this diagram is teaching farmers to build their barns for proper movement of air, so fresh air could be constantly cycled through the barn. This was known as the King system of ventilation, and allowed that air to move through so that fresh air would be constantly replaced, so the tuberculosis would not be stagnant in that stale air and easily spread from animal to animal. This makes us jump to some current topics in agriculture. Farming 100 years ago had a lot of things we need to understand. Today, there are some major things. The organic movement, as more and more people are wanting farmers to move away from the use of pesticides and go back to the way farming was done in the early 1900s, when there was very, very little chemicals used. You can see the rapid advancement of technology, and farmers need to keep up on that constantly. And manure now is being viewed as a commodity. There's potential with manure becoming as important as gold. As fertilizer prices shoot through the roof, manure could return to its prominence. Unfortunately, we see that manure is not managed very well, and that is something that definitely could change if manure starts being viewed as something that people could buy. Economies of scale. The fight between small and large farms and dealing with producing food on a massive scale is something that continues to be an issue that farmers need to address. Then profit versus quality. Can we produce quality food without just focusing on profits? It's a huge issue at this time. And then of utmost importance is the loss of topsoil. We're seeing topsoil being depleted at a very large rate, and it will take very long to return that. That's an important topic for farmers to understand. Because again, invariably, at the root of every ancient American civilization's collapse was an agricultural mistake. When their agriculture faltered, so did the civilization. It's of utmost importance for humankind. This second part will be a little bit quicker, looking at some of those major technological booms that were happening. I mentioned the manure spreader, but also in the 1910s, this newer invention, the tractor, was starting to gain traction. And it was partially due to World War I. Quote from History on Tractors, Tractor by Lee Clancher. For better or worse, the mechanization of the farm can trace its roots to humanity's appetite for destruction, particularly when manifested in worldwide conflicts. During World War I, massive amount of people left off to go to the war, leaving farms without the ability to produce food for not just America, but also Europe. That pushed in more and more competition to produce tractors and produce products that would allow farmers to produce food more efficiently and quicker. After World War I, this led to an economic depression. There was a huge influx of yields during World War I, and there were buyers for that food. But after World War I, there was a huge decline because Europe started producing its own food again. And farmers came back to more technology. They didn't need as many workers. Kind of caused an economic depression before the 1929 depression, causing many farmers to need to leave and go find work in the city or learn to adapt. Very much related to the rise of technology this time. Specifically, the technology, tractors, I mentioned milk machines, no longer needing to milk cows by hand, the manure spreader, combine, the electrification of the countryside, completely changing farming for the rest of the decade. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much technology coming in the 1920s and later. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Some different technologies. This, the gasoline engine running cream separator, no longer needing to hand crank this to separate the cream from the milk to take it to the customer. Having milk wagons to being able to efficiently take the milk to the general store, to the cheese factory, was something that was not regularly had earlier on. This is an automatic bottle filler. Being able to fill those bottles much quicker than they would have been able to before. Again, getting it to market faster, which can lead to more profits. This is a corn grinder. Again, more automation for the farmer. This, a corn sheller. This is a corn or a silo filler. How do you fill those silos? Oftentimes these were run by steam engines, allowing them to fill those silos and feed their animals throughout the year. You can see this in kind of the setup that they would have had with these. The baler. You can see this. Now we are doing big bales and big squares, but for much of the 1900s, little square bales were the thing that farmers wanted and needed to feed their animals long term and through the winter months. The junior stacker for hay, to get hay into the barn and out of the fields. A loader for loading up the wagons with the hay. Plows and tractors, making it more easy for the farmer to do things quickly. The hay bine, or the mower, and then also the rake. You can see an example of a mower. It's going to allow farmers to use their tractors or horses to cut hay and make that process go much faster. See the cutter bar here and how that was going to work. Being able to use the side rake to preserve that hay and have more quality feed for the animals. A grain elevator to get food up into the barn more quickly into the silos and grain silos. So important, again, saving time and money for farmers. A seed drill. So imagine how much faster things would go with tractors in one of these. My final thoughts to kind of wrap up this. You can see farming is an incredibly important thing for every civilization. But it's also so important to look back and understand that we're at a crucial time in our history to examine the way that we're doing farming and to look at the past and say, what are some mistakes that they made then with the depletion of the soil through king wheat and looking to dairying to revitalize that soil and looking to managing manure properly and also working with the massive amount of technology and trying to wrap their minds around that and the need for that education to consistently be learning more and more and more and promoting that in our schools and promoting that on our farms so that agriculture can continue to sustain the civilizations of the world for the next 100 years. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this look at farming 100 years ago.